Hello out there and welcome. This is Smart Prosperity, the podcast. It's a show about the green economy in Canada, the current affairs, the politics, the business, the technology, and the ideas at the intersection of the environment and the economy. We do a new episode every 2 weeks, and they are always 25 minutes or less. I'm your host, Eric Campbell. On today's show, we're doing something special. It's our final episode of the year 2020. I know, a year that we all want to just go away. So we're celebrating by inviting 4 of Canada's sharpest, most authoritative journalists and media commentators to share what they think are the biggest green economy stories of 2020. Now, remember how I've been telling you that every episode is 25 minutes or less? Well, every rule has an exception, and this episode is one of those exceptions. It's an end-of-year special, so we're allowing ourselves a little more time and a little more fun. So, settle in for a look at the year that was in the green economy. Before I introduce our guests, if you're like me, you need a bit of a reminder of what happened this year that wasn't a pandemic. So, here is your green economy news mashup for the year 2020.
We're going to turn now to that devastation in Australia, where thousands of firefighters and first responders are battling unprecedented wildfires. At least 2 dozen dead.
Demonstrators say they support Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs who want to keep the project out of their territory. As Davos gets ready to host the who's who of business and politics next week, the top 5 risks, according to a survey by the World Economic Forum, are for the first time environmental.
Big news from BlackRock this morning. The world's largest asset manager now announcing the firm will make investment decisions with environmental sustainability at its core.
Now to the future of a controversial oil sands project. Teck Resources is pulling its application for the proposed Frontier Oil Sands mine.
For the first time in history, US oil went into negative territory, a doomsday scenario for the entire industry.
A devastating day in the gleaming capital of Canada's oil patch. The price collapse has wiped out large portions of
Now, one very rare positive effect of the past few months has been on the environment. Biggest ever reduction in the volume of carbon dioxide released into the world's atmosphere has been recorded since March.
New Conservative leader Erin O'Toole has spent the last few weeks.
Toronto lawyer Annamie Paul is Canada's newest federal leader.
A fight over the federal carbon tax is now in front of Canada's highest court. Appeal.
Tonight, the desperate battle to contain California's historic fires is now a race against time.
The federal and Ontario governments are teaming up to provide the Ford Motor Company with a combined $590 million to produce electric vehicles in Oakville, Ontario.
Ended the war on beautiful, clean coal. We're going to get back into the Paris Agreement, back into the business of leading the world.
Fox News Decision Desk can now project that former Vice President Joe Biden will win.
Our government promised to legally bind Canada to its commitment of net zero emissions.
Some people have been talking about peak oil for a long time now, but when the International Energy Agency adds its voice to that debate, it may be time for the energy sector to sit up and take notice.
So, now to our guests, and to help us make sense of this year when it comes to all things green economy. We've got Heather Schofield. She's the Ottawa Bureau Chief and an economics columnist for the Toronto Star. Adam Radwanski is a climate and economy columnist at the Globe and Mail. Mia Rabson is the energy and environment reporter for the Canadian Press. And Sean McCarthy is a freelance writer and former national business correspondent at the Globe and Mail. Thanks to all 4 of you for being part of this year-end spectacular.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Heather, let's start with you. What for you has been the biggest story related to the green economy of 2020?
Well, my prism into this is really watching the federal politics. So for me, the story of the year is the up and down federal ambition to fight climate change in the recovery as we get out of the pandemic. It's not a lightning strike of a story, but one that's still developing. And I think will have legs for some time to come. So, we started out in March, with a rumble of a Build Back Better recovery when this is all over. And there was so much hope, I think, among people who care about the environment that one thing that we could actually, a silver lining to all of this is that, we could actually build back better with a massive stimulus fund. Europe is doing it. And people around the world are talking about this, but it hasn't actually materialized quite yet. I think the talk around the ambition for climate change met up with the cold, hard reality of the pandemic, and that kind of showed up within discussions in the cabinet and showed up in the throne speech and again last week in the fiscal update. This tension between wanting to pile on and do a lot to reduce emissions, but at the same time, the people who have been pummeled by the pandemic over and over again are those service workers, the low-income workers, people of color, often women, and they aren't the same people who could be put to work, at least not easily, by a massive green stimulus plan. So that's still playing out, and I think we will continue to see that tension play out into the coming year.
And the backdrop for this, of course, is the 2008-2009 recession, when there was this really big increase in climate emissions that came out of that recovery, and that being something that people want to fix this time around. Sean, you wrote a lot about a green recovery for corporate nights this year. Do you agree that maybe the federal government is wavering in its commitment to a green recovery just now?
Yes, I do, and for the reasons that Heather said, largely, although I think that there are some concerns about deficits and, fiscal guardrails and that sort of thing that Chrystia Freeland has enunciated. But one of the things I heard early from people in government was that they were concerned of messaging to people having to deal with yet another crisis, even as they're dealing with COVID. And I think that there was a reluctance to sort of pour on more crisis talk when people are still, really in the grips of this one. So we shall see what comes in 2021. They say that they're not done and there will be big recovery spending, but I'd be surprised, frankly, if it were anything in the range that the Europeans and even Joe Biden in the U.S. are talking about.
Really? So maybe we should be lowering our expectations for a green recovery in 2021. Adam, you also wrote a lot about this in 2020. Have you got anything to add?
Well, you're right on expectations, and they really raised expectations, the federal government did last spring. I mean, there was that flurry right as the pandemic began, around April, May, even in March, where there was an expectation that there was going to be a big package of green recovery stuff coming in the summer. The three ministers, word was circulating, the three ministers, McKenna and Wilkinson and Guilbeault were working on it. Environmental groups and various lobby groups were scrambling to get the proposals in, and then kind of nothing happened. And the government, I found, at least people in the government, got touchy when you suggested that they were backing away from it. And it was, well, no, we're just taking our time. It's not that stage of the pandemic yet. But I don't know how you'd have any other view of it by this point, and they've slowed it down. And I wonder a bit how much they've been scared off by, there has been a lot of talk, both from the opposition and frankly from a lot of media, maybe not people on this panel so much, but otherwise, of, this is the government, taking its eye off the ball. This is the obsessing with pet projects as opposed to dealing with the emergency at hand. And I certainly think they have to be careful that they don't take their eye off the ball with the pandemic. But there is kind of a walking and chewing gum thing going on here too. And, plenty of other countries, as far back as last spring, were rolling out very large packages aimed at steering a green recovery after the fact. The EU broadly, Germany and France within it, South Korea. I mean, there are plenty of countries that have been able to do this, and I'm not sure it should be beyond the capability of a large government in Ottawa to simultaneously plan for the relative long term and the immediate and short term at the same time.
Really interesting. Okay, so story number one, the federal government's commitment or not so commitment to a green economic recovery following from COVID. Let's move on to another biggest story of the green economy in 2020. Mia, over to you. What's your biggest story for 2020?
The thing that really stood out to me, amongst many things to stand out, was just the number of emails, news releases, announcements that continued to flow into my inbox about investors walking away from Canadian energy, mostly from the oil sands. It sort of started right away in January with BlackRock sort of making its big climate announcement and then announcing that it would sort of be withdrawing its oil sands investments in February. And then it just sort of seemed to be a steady stream after that. They had the Norwegian Oil Fund in May. I think the Deutsche Bank was in July. France's energy company Total in July. And they're all basically using climate change and the lack of a clear plan forward for the oil sands as their excuse. They're saying that their investors all have more desire or a bigger desire to see climate change being and risk from climate change being factored into the investments. And I think it's in some ways a little bit of a cop-out because some of these companies are also, or investors are also not seeing the oil sands as a great investment from a financial point of view. Obviously, oil prices, the oil shock in March did not help. So we'll have to see if this holds, if there is any kind of rebound from the oil sands. But it's, many of the environment lobbyists that talk to me on a regular basis have been quite buoyed by some of these announcements because they think this is sort of a sign of a big tide turning for investments in Canada and Canadian energy. And it's a sign that the efforts to paint the oil sands in particular as a not green investment, as sort of worse than some of the other oil investments, has been working despite very, very heavy efforts by the oil sands themselves to say that they are more environmentally friendly than others, and that if you withdraw from their companies or from Canadian companies, you're just going to be funneling that money to other companies who are less environmentally friendly. So it's their pitches hasn't worked, even though a lot of oil sands companies have shown that they have reduced their emissions intensity. Generally, they're still seen as being less efficient than some of the other oil investments around the world. And it's a big picture for Canada. We relied very heavily on those resources as part of our economy. And the Canadian banks, I should note, have not really followed suit. They have sort of stepped in. I think TD Bank was the first just a couple weeks ago to say that they were going to sort of go to net zero. But they and all of the other Canadian banks are still very heavily invested in oil.
Yeah, I was going to ask about Canadian banks. So changes in how investors are approaching investment. Now, I think we've heard kind of these rumblings before. Heather, do you think, is this something that's going to stick into 2021? Is this something that's going to have real repercussions throughout Canada's energy system and kind of the fossil fuel sector more broadly?
Yes, definitely. I mean, I think sustainable finance and the ability for energy producers to get ESG completely factored into how they account for what they're doing in a way that's standardized and in a way that can be an attractive investment is going to be a big challenge for those companies going forward. I mean, we are, I think, slow in this country to catch up with that movement, which is a bit worrisome because the energy sector is just so important to our economy. So I think, 2021 will be a challenge, not just for the corporate sector, but also in federal politics. There are some decisions that could be made among regulators and at the policy level that would, help standardize and help with transparency and really push the companies to be more competitive on that level around the world. But they haven't done yet. And, they seem to be moving a little bit in that direction. We saw some, green bonds that were announced in the fiscal update last week. And it is, the regulators are moving in that direction. The appointment of Michael Sabia to be the Deputy Minister of Finance today is probably part of that picture too. But there is a lot of work to be done in a big hurry, I think, if we're going to remain competitive on this front, especially as the United States under Joe Biden, I think, will be moving pretty quickly on that front.
Yeah, and Sean or Adam, feel free to jump in terms of Canada's movement in this direction. While, as Mia says, Canada's banks have been slow to catch on, there have been, 2020 was also marked by the return of Mark Carney to Ottawa, and he's been outspoken on climate and finance. Also, a new governor of the Bank of Canada, and Tiff Macklem, somebody who had been a member of the expert panel on sustainable finance. So and I think we've already heard him speak to climate in some of his early communications. Is Canada going to be moving more and more into this direction of sustainable finance and climate risk disclosure in 2021?
Drag kicking and screaming is probably in terms of how they're moving forward. Tiff Macklem went from academia and running, chairing that sustainable finance panel to governor of the Bank of Canada, and is really sort of, yes, he has talked about the importance of climate change, but he has also drawn very clear lines around the bank in terms of what its role is. One of the big problems in Canada always is the federal government doesn't regulate the securities industry, except very indirectly. And this is really a provincial issue. If you want mandatory or even disclosure rules that allow for comparisons, which is what the institutional investors want. So it's really important to bring the provinces on board. There was a provincial capital markets report that urged the Ford government to implement some of these things, but I haven't heard any take up from the provincial government on it. And the Ontario Securities Commission is obviously a big one because most of these companies are listed there. But as Heather mentioned, Joe Biden is probably going to get down this path. And so, what Canada does is if we're late to the party, we don't get to write the rules, and we don't get to participate much. So we will be, as so often the case, rule takers rather than rule makers.
Terrific. Thanks for pitching that story, Mia. Let's move on over to you, Adam. What do you think is the biggest green economy story of 2020?
I'll go with one that we've kind of touched on a few times already, which is the election of Joe Biden as president of the United States. I don't think you can understate the significance of going from a president who is essentially a climate change denier and has essentially been actively trying to encourage climate change in Donald Trump, to somebody elected with by far the most ambitious climate agenda of anybody who's taken that office. Now, the obvious caveat here, which we've all heard a million times since the election, is that without control of the Senate, which the Democrats, they could get in January, but you wouldn't bet on it, that it'll be hard for him to advance his agenda. I think that's true in the sense that, I don't think we're going to see, the $2 trillion of investment maybe that he ran on. But I think you can't understate a couple of things there. I mean, one is just at the international level, having somebody take a leadership role again from the U.S., rejoining Paris and helping set new targets or trying to push toward new targets, pushing other countries, possibly aggressively through trade policies, which he suggested, but certainly in terms of moral leadership, I think that's important. I think domestically in the U.S., there is an awful lot he can do, or his administration can do, through executive action, through regulatory moves, even just undoing or reestablishing the many environmental rules that were scrapped by the Trump administration and upgrading and imposing new ones. There is a lot to be done there. And I think from a Canadian perspective, there are some ways that this is really going to affect Canadian climate policy. In some ways, quite helpfully, it's going to be, because we tend to be synchronized on auto emissions rules in particular, vehicle emissions rules. I think it's going to be quite helpful in reducing transportation emissions here at a continental level and helping Canada quite a bit in doing that, which is a huge challenge. And a bunch of other policy areas where it may be possible to move in lockstep. At the same time, I think it'll also challenge our government here. It's been a kind of a comfortable position for Canada within the North American context to be, kind of by default, the most progressive national government on climate policy. That may change pretty quickly. You're going to have, administration in the U.S. pushing, again, in sort of the moral sense and also in the economic sense. If we want to compete in clean tech, we're going to have to step up our game because there's going to be a lot more being done at the national level in the U.S. to try to attract investment to that sector there.
Thanks, Adam. Heather and Mia, I know both of you have also written about the implications of a Biden presidency for Canada, particularly on the climate file. Is it right that, as Adam says, Canada's going to be turning into somebody who's been trying to drag the U.S. To somebody who's being to a country that's being dragged by the U.S. on climate policy? Heather, maybe starting with you.
Yeah, I think there is a pretty big risk that they could leapfrog us, and so the challenge is out there. That new administration will really push Canada to work harder at what it does on clean tech and improving its emissions records. There's an interesting dynamic there too in his proposal to look at carbon border adjustments. If that's a risk to us, but there's also an opportunity generally, because I think if the Trudeau administration, and then it can work with the Biden administration to if we can look at it as a North American or Canada-US border towards the rest of the world, then there's an opportunity for us to actually implement an interesting policy. But if we're on the wrong side of that, it will sting. So certainly a challenge for both governments, I think, to grapple with going forward.
Yeah, I think for sure there's definitely the opportunity for the U.S. to go ahead of Canada. I mean, they're enormous compared to us. So of course, if they actually have a president who is backing some of this movement, that could happen. But from some of the people I spoke to earlier this fall about the impact, one of the interesting options or potentials for Canada is to suddenly have a bigger market for some of our clean tech products that we never had before. And also no longer having Canadian environment laws sort of go headbutting up against sort of American resistance. And I'm thinking, for example, the carbon tax on big emitters. We had sort of set some of that, some of the levels of those, knowing that some of these companies or industries might just move. And if we don't have to do that, some of our own policies could actually potentially get stronger if we're not sort of fighting against this Goliath beside us. So there's some opportunities for Canada in what the U.S. is doing, as well as maybe just a little bit of a wake-up call that we can't wait any longer, or we really will get left behind.
Fantastic, and that's a great little synthesis of probably the implications of the Biden presidency for Canada on climate. So let's leave that one there and continue racing through these big stories of these big green economy stories of 2020. Sean, finally over to you. Which is the biggest story for you this year?
Well, I think actually the pandemic itself is the biggest energy and environment story and climate story, and for a number of the reasons that we spoke about, in terms of creating potential for a major green recovery and a lot of stimulus spending that wouldn't happen otherwise. The direct impact of the pandemic was to reduce global emissions. Air travel is way down. All sorts of reasons why emissions generally, as a result of the pandemic, are down. And so you have all these direct impacts. But I think maybe more importantly is the fact that this has just really upset the entire table here, and what we thought we knew about the world, frankly, is not true anymore. And so, two things that we did think many of us thought we knew about the world, though, do seem to be true. And I think it'll be very interesting to see whether broadly the citizens of Canada and the United States and around the world and governments, even non-democratic governments, take heed to this, which is the importance of science-based evidence. We were warned about this and did not respond and are paying the price. So ignoring science and foreshadowing and evidence of a looming crisis is a bad idea. And secondly, the importance of collective action and government, in fact. And so, both domestically and then the importance of international cooperation in dealing with crises. And so these are two of the big lessons I think that you can draw from it. But, the other side of the aisle, so to speak, there are a lot of people who are taking the exact opposite lessons from this, and the distrust of COVID expertise looms large in North America and presumably around the world. And I think a lot of people are taking the exact opposite lessons from this, which is, that the experts are exaggerating, that governments are overreacting and are trying to take away your freedoms. And you can see how that mindset, that kind of populist mindset, if you will, although I don't like that phrase for it, could play out again in climate change and drive the polarization even more. So I think the world is the dangerous word is reset, because it has so many connotations, but we are having to reset all of our assumptions about what works and what doesn't work, and that's true in terms of how the world can deal with climate change as well.
Yeah, so many linkages that have been drawn throughout the year between the pandemic and climate change. I'm really interested in this emissions drop, with some folks predicting that there's going to be about a 7% drop in global emissions in 2020 as a result of the pandemic. And here in Canada, we've got a very stubborn level of emissions. We haven't had much in the way of emissions drops over the past several years. And I wonder how this affects the Canadian mentality of actually being able to actually seeing emissions drop and being reminded that this is an actual possibility. Adam, do you see the pandemic kind of on the climate side affecting the Canadian psyche in any positive ways?
My honest answer is I don't know. I think, I've been wondering since the start of the pandemic, is this, and for Canadians or anybody else, is this going to inspire us, toward more sort of willingness for collective action, more sense of responsibility, more of a feeling of, well, we pulled together on this and we can do it in other stuff? Are we going to be instead heading into sort of this, post-pandemic hedonistic period where we all just want to live our lives and not be, and have as much fun as possible and not be told how we need to change our behavior? I really don't know. What I do think in terms of public policy is there are so many unknowns around this that maybe it's a good time to focus on the knowns. What I mean by that is, I don't know, we don't know how much, for instance, our transportation, our commuting patterns are going to be affected, right? We just don't know how many people are going to go back to work, go back to commuting, how many are going to ride public transit again if they do. What we do know is, we're all a lot of us are still going to be driving cars in one way or another, and using other forms of transportation in some way. So focus, say, on electrification, which we know is going to happen at some point, but we can maybe work toward accelerating that, which is probably not going to change, regardless of how our patterns are disrupted. So there are ways to look at trends that seem fairly consistent and maybe seize the opportunity to invest in them. I don't know how you can predict how we're all going to react to this, because just none of us have really gone through this in our lifetimes before.
Yeah, so a wild card. But Sean, thanks for putting that one forward. There's no chance we can get through a panel focused on the year 2020 and not talk a lot about the pandemic. Now, we haven't got much time left, but I do want to hear about the big stories that were on your short list but didn't cut it as number one. Or alternatively, the stories that may be on other people's shortlists out there, but weren't on yours, and why that is. Mia, maybe we could start with you. Are there one or two stories that also jumped out to you as being big green economy stories for 2020 that almost made your number one?
Well, one of the ones that I was thinking of, but didn't pick, partly just because it's still a little bit of an unknown about what will happen, was the report a couple of weeks ago from the Canada Energy Regulator, the new regulator that's sort of the new National Energy Board, and their report that looked ahead at fossil fuel production and demand. And it suggested that even under a scenario where Canada is relatively lax about introducing any new climate policies beyond what we have today, that the pipelines that are being built really won't be needed, that maybe one of them is needed to handle the increased growth in production. And that would mean that, for example, the multi-billion-dollar investment that Canada made in the Trans Mountain Pipeline, all of that political capital that the Trudeau government threw at that particular project might have been for nothing. And it'll be really interesting to see if that comes to fruition. But it really hit home with me just because even their assumptions don't take into account what Canada is planning on doing. Things like the clean energy, the clean fuel standard, for example, were not really taken into account in that report on their projections. And so, unless basically Canada doesn't lift a finger to do anything more on climate from today forward, which seems very not likely, these pipelines that we have just been fighting about and arguing and having political battles for years, it might be that the markets and the world make that decision for us.
Wow. Yeah. Has Canada reached peak pipeline already? Okay. Thanks for that, Mia. Heather, over to you. Were there any other stories that were on your short list?
Yeah. So the one for me that didn't make the cut was the Ford investment to make battery electric vehicles in Oakville. They're working together with the provincial and federal governments with funding to keep that plant afloat and switch production over to producing battery electric vehicles along with the batteries. It's a fascinating story to me. It's obviously very important to the workforce around Toronto, and it's important for the auto sector generally to make an impact and in Canada to show that we can keep with that wave and try to at least be competitive in the electric vehicle market. But it doesn't actually cut emissions unless people buy these vehicles soon and start driving them, and that requires a whole bunch of different incentives on the consumer side, as well as infrastructure on just plugging or just being able to get the network to get those vehicles up and running. So it's an interesting development, but let's see where the emissions reductions actually come from that investment.
Yeah, interesting. The kind of so far it's been an economic play, but the climate play for Canada is still to be determined. Thanks for that, Heather. Adam, over to you. Anything else on your list for 2020?
I'll mention two very quickly. One very quickly and simply is just the climate impacts becoming harder to ignore, both in the extreme weather sense and the wildfires in California, Australia. I think that we shouldn't overlook that should be making this issue more inescapable by the day. The other one I'll mention, going back to the pre-pandemic before times. Does anybody else remember the Tech Frontier mine? This was like one of the big stories back in January, February. This was, the definitive Canadian climate story that nobody talks about anymore. And that very briefly was the project in Alberta that was awaiting federal approval, and then the plug got pulled before that was given one way or the other. And then everybody got to weigh in as to whether this is a reflection of the federal government not being sufficiently resource friendly, or whether it was a reflection of the politics being too toxic, and maybe even the Alberta government taking climate insufficiently seriously. I think in retrospect, part of the reason we don't talk about it as much, I guess, anymore, or one reason we might not talk about it as much anymore, is that I think the economics of that project were shaky even at the time. If it had gotten approval, it was somewhat doubtful it would ever actually go forward. And I think all the more so now, looking at what we know about what's happening in that industry, it's pretty hard to imagine that project happening one way or the other. And so I guess we can maybe hope a little bit that we don't continue this constant cycle of these divisive debates over individual projects, individual pipelines, et cetera, when there are much larger trends happening that we should be focused on, and there are maybe some inescapable directions that the world is going that don't need to get completely bogged down domestically in that sort of fight. So that would be my other one. Thanks,
Adam. Yeah, who could forget the big $20 billion investment that didn't happen in Canada's oil sands pre-pandemic. So thanks for contributing that one. Sean, finally over to you for any stories that were on your radar but didn't make your number one this year.
So it was interesting because I was going to mention one or two, and then Adam mentioned climate impacts, and it was like, yeah, the story that nobody's writing about. Well, I mean, we write about climate impacts. What we're not, the story that's not happening, and it was not in the throne speech, and it was very little in the fall economic statement, is the need for resilience, is the need for adaptation, because for even if the world rallies and holds climate increase temperatures to 1.5 degrees Celsius, there are going to be enormous climate impacts that we're going to have to adapt to, and that's going to require planning, and it's going to require money, and it's going to require all sorts of other resources. And again, I wouldn't single out Canada here, because I don't think anybody is really prepared for that or adequately preparing for it. So it was interesting to see it get very little attention in the big federal statements of this fall, and I think that's going to have to change.
All right. Well, we'll end it there with the story that hasn't been told enough, which is climate impacts of 2020. Thank you so much for being part of this panel. I feel incredibly privileged to have had the chance to speak with all of you. I hope 2021 is a good year for all of you.
Same to you. Thank you.
Likewise. Take care. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric.
That, again, was Heather Schofield from the Toronto Star, Adam Radwanski from the Globe and Mail, Mia Rabson from the Canadian Press, and Sean McCarthy, who I should also mention is on the editorial board for this podcast. Now, incidentally, Adam passes on his apologies for the chainsaws and the tree cutting that was happening outside his window during that panel. It just sounded a little bit like that scene from National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation is all. Now, if you want to see my selection of Heather, Adam, Mia, and Sean's best articles of 2020, go check out this episode's webpage at podcast.smartprosperity.ca. Oh, that's it for today's show, today's special year-end show. I hope you had as much fun as I did. We'll be back in the first week of 2021. But if you're looking for something to listen to in the meantime, the back catalog of all 5 Smart Prosperity, the podcast shows, is available on our website at podcast.smartprosperity.ca. Thanks for listening. Happy holidays, stay safe, and maybe most of all, Happy New Year.